They lay in wait like a stealthy predator, ready to unleash terror on the airstrip. Hours later, a chilling command echoed through Jonestown, one that sealed the fates of hundreds. But was this really mass suicide? Or mass murder disguised as choice? Please like, subscribe, and comment on Disaster Register, where we bring you true and tragic tales. Guyana, 1978. Deep in the jungle, far away from civilization. A remote commune spread a promise of safety and equality. A safe haven from a country filled with racism and discrimination. Families flocked in, with high hopes of a new beginning. But then, a US congressman flew in to investigate, and this so-called utopia collapsed. What happened next changed how we understand cult control. Forever. But disturbingly, some argue the US government and media share part of the blame. Could Jonestown have been prevented, or was it always doomed? The People's Temple. Known to many as a death cult that left behind a horrible tragedy as its mark in this world, didn't begin as a terrifying doomsday cult. Under the leadership of its founder, Jim Jones, in the 1950s and 1960s, the People's Temple claimed to practice a blend of socialist ideals and Christian principles, which they called apostolic socialism. In doing so, Jim Jones preached that those who remained drugged with the opiate of religion had to be brought to enlightenment. Enlightenment in the sense of a state of socialist awareness, free from what they saw as religious dogma. Jim Jones's passionate sermons about social justice drew in a lot of people who were searching for fairness and faith in a period when much of America was still rife with segregation and racism. It's unsettling to realize that many of the same tactics he used to attract followers are still used by politicians and influencers today. After facing intense criticism in Indiana, Jim Jones's decision to move the People's Temple to Redwood Valley, California in 1965 proved to be a pivotal turning point for the temple's growth. By the early 1970s, the temple had opened other branches in Los Angeles and San Francisco, eventually moving its headquarters to San Francisco. Here, the temple grew in influence and became heavily involved in politics, so much so that Jim Jones was appointed as the chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority. But behind the temple's message of social justice that led to huge political success and growth was a horrible reality of manipulation and exploitation deeply hidden away. Things eventually started to fall apart in the fall of 1973. After 8 members fled the People's Temple, critical newspaper articles by Lester Kinsolving started to gain public attention. Jim Jones started to fear that a police or media crackdown may be on the horizon. As the truth of how Jim Jones ran the People's Temple began to rear up its ugly head, Jim Jones's paranoia grew, which forced him to coerce his followers into relocating to the remote jungle of Guyana in 1977. Members of the People's Temple that followed Jim Jones had to endure an oppressive tropical climate and struggle for the limited resources available in the jungle. But Jim Jones's declaration that they were building a utopian society free from government or media meddling forced them to endure hours of unpaid hard labor to build a working agricultural commune, soon known as Jonestown. Many members of the temple's initial assumption that Jonestown would be a paradise began to crumble, as working 6 days a week from 6:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. began to take its toll on them. Not only were members overworked, but they also had to endure loudspeaker sermons of socialism as armed men patrolled Jonestown. Back in the US, however, relatives of Jonestown inhabitants began to grow concerned by the strange letters they received from their people. They soon began to mount pressure on the government to investigate, as media attention began to fall on Jonestown once again. The outcry of concerned relatives in the US soon reached the ears of California Congressman Leo Ryan. Soon after, Ryan organized a delegation of journalists and others with a mission to find out what exactly was going on in that secluded corner of the world. Ryan and the delegation arrived at Jonestown on the 17th of November, 1978. They were received warmly with Jim Jones himself hosting them, but this warm welcome was short-lived. Two temple members, Vernon Gosney and Monica Bagby, summoned courage and made the first move to defect that very night. Although Gosney mistook NBC reporter Don Harris for Ryan, he was still able to pass a note across. The note read, "Dear Congressman, Vernon Gosney and Monica Bagby, please help us get out of Jonestown," but by stepping in, Ryan signed his own death warrant, and deep down, Jim Jones knew it. A child witnessed this desperate act and immediately alerted other temple members. Ryan agreed to get them out of Jonestown, and the next morning a large dump truck was already waiting to transport them to safety. Vernon Gosney and Monica Bagby's bravery inspired other defectors to step forward, stating their intentions to leave. Now stuck between a rock and a hard place, Jim Jones agreed to let the defectors leave, but not without planting a mole among them. Shortly after the dump truck left Jonestown, temple member Don Ujara Sly attacked Ryan with a knife, but was immediately wrestled to the ground and restrained. With the danger taken care of, the group continued their journey to the airstrip, where they would board an aircraft bound for Georgetown. Because the group had grown in number, an additional aircraft had to be provided for them. But when the entourage arrived at the Port Kaituma airstrip between 4:30 p.m. and 4:45 p.m., the planes had not appeared as scheduled, so they waited at the airstrip, ignorant of the tragic storm heading their way. After waiting for a while, a 19-passenger Twin Otter from Guyana Airways and a 6-passenger Cessna arrived to fly them to Georgetown. But what was meant to be a peaceful commute turned into a life-and-death scenario within seconds. Just when the Cessna had taxied to the far end of the airstrip, temple member Larry, Jim Jones's chess piece among the defectors, sprang into action. He pulled out a handgun and started shooting the passengers with reckless abandon. Bagby and Gosney were immediately caught in the fire and sustained gunshot wounds. His shooting spree came to an end, however, when Dale Parks, another passenger, was able to disarm Larry and avoid getting killed after the gun misfired. But this was just the beginning of the group's woes that evening. At the same time when the Cessna was under attack, a tractor with a trailer attached, driven by members of the temple's Red Brigade security squad, arrived at the airstrip and approached the larger Twin Otter aircraft. Without waiting for Ryan and everyone else to process what was happening, they opened fire with handguns, shotguns, and rifles. Congressman Ryan was killed within the first few minutes of the shooting after sustaining 20 gunshot wounds. 3 members of the delegation and 1 defector were also killed. Back at Jonestown, Jim Jones brought his followers together for what would be his final address, which would be broadcast over the ever-present loudspeakers. His message was horrifying, yet resolute, as he urged his followers to commit a revolutionary suicide. Large vats of cyanide-laced fruit drinks were prepared, and years of brainwashing and manipulation came into play. Temple members fed their own children and infants the deadly cocktail first before drinking it themselves. Armed guards stood by to enforce the horrible acts, leaving many with no choice but to comply. Screams and cries echoed through the pavilion as the poison raced through the bodies of children and adults alike. By the time the last voices faded away to eternal silence, more than 900 men, women, and children lay dead. This terrible incident stood out as the largest loss of American civilian lives in a single event, up until the 9/11 attacks in 2001. The mass suicide on such a massive scale at Jonestown took the world by storm and sent waves of shock throughout the globe. Headlines were dominated by the glaring images of rows upon rows of bodies in the Guyanese jungle. People found it difficult to understand how so many people readily ended their lives at the command of one man. Accounts of people who survived the ordeal painted a vivid picture of how it all transpired. It wasn't a willing mass suicide, as most would have thought, but a reluctant suicide born out of coercion, fear, and despair. As news of the tragedy spread, so did the phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid." This went on to become part of popular culture, cementing itself as a symbolic representation for blindly following a charismatic leader or a potentially disastrous idea without critical evaluation. But in reality, the poisoned drink was grape flavor aid, which was a cheaper knockoff. Imagine feeding your own child poison while armed men stand by, daring you to resist. Is that suicide or murder? Testimonies from survivors helped to remove the fog and expose how that level of control was possible. Temple members were completely cut off from the outside world. Their passports were confiscated, movements restricted, and they were heavily deprived of sleep by the loudspeaker sermons that always kept them awake. Isolation, fear, and sleep deprivation worked together like an acid that slowly eroded any form of resistance in temple members until only obedience became their only option. The tragedy sparked a revolution of policy changes that forced governments, academics, and educators to rethink how societies understand cults and coercive groups. New policies emphasized the need for movements that isolate their members to be isolated. Jonestown became a case study on the dangers of manipulation, groupthink, and unchecked authority in classrooms and universities throughout America. Today, memorials stand in California and Guyana to honor the dead. Survivor networks persist to this day, continuing to support those who lived through the horrors of that day. The promise of a safe haven turned into a deadly trap that sealed the fates of hundreds. A moment of hope flourished briefly for those who wanted to escape and turned into a vicious attack at the airstrip. The Jonestown tragedy is more than a story of mass suicide. It's also a hard lesson on how coercive control can take away freedom, choice, and even life itself. If we are to honor those who left, we must look beyond the myths and slogans born from the tragedy, and remember that the victims were people like us, who were only searching for a better world but lost their lives in the process. By understanding how they were controlled, we not only keep their memory alive, but also strengthen our ability to protect others from suffering the same fate. But here's the terrifying question. Have we really learned anything? Or are today's digital echo chambers just a new form of Jonestown without the cyanide? Maybe the true tragedy of Jonestown isn't just how 900 people died, but how easy it was to convince them it was the right thing to do. Like and subscribe if you want to stay updated on our latest videos.